We are reading from Luke, the calling of the first disciples. Once, while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw two boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught many fish, so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signalled their partners at the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats, so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of the fish they had taken. And so also were John and James, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching people." When they brought their boats to the shore, they left everything and followed him. And this is the word of the Lord.
Has fishing ever been a worshipful experience for you? I mean, fishing as worship. Not quite sure about that one. I mean, fishing for me, historically, has always been spending the first 20 minutes trying to untangle the line from the last time. Or smelly fingers from the bait. Or just simply feeding the fish by putting the line in and then nibble and pulling it up and there's nothing there. Certainly far from praising God whilst I'm fishing, or literally saying as an act of worship, "Oh my God." I've heard God's name proclaimed at the football field before, or at something spectacular, or even something disturbing, or even perhaps in people's bedrooms. But fishing? Oh my God. Oh my God, fishing. But this is an episode in the life of Jesus and the disciples. The call of the first disciples, who some of them were fishermen. And it involves an act of worship. And it involves an act of call to mission. Let's recap the scene in that scripture reading that Carole read to us just then. There's a crowd. We don't know how big the crowd is, but there's a crowd. There's a gathering of people around the word. The word is being preached. We don't know if it's being preached by Jesus or by someone else. The scriptures doesn't actually tell us that. There's a lake. There are some boats. There are some tired fishermen who are washing their nets because maybe they've fished all night, apparently. And of course, there's Jesus. So Jesus gets into a boat, a small boat, rickety boat probably, and asks to be taken fishing. And then to everyone's surprise, fish are caught. Surprise, surprise. Simon exclaims, "Oh my God." An act of worship. For he falls to his feet, to his knees, and worships. Then the fish are dragged to shore, and Jesus calls these blokes to follow him. And they do. A pretty spectacular scene, really, when you stop and just pause and think about it. A worship response was not to the act of teaching, nor was it to the act of preaching, nor to anyone, let alone Jesus. but an act of worship at the response to a catch of fish. Oh my God. It is the experience of the catch of fish that evoked a worshipful response. I was thinking about this week, as I do, and I thought about our church. Not our church in particular, but our churches. And we tend to get excited over the drama that happens within worship. It might be the worship leaders, Steve or myself or other places. The hands might be in the air. The drummer might be banging away at the drums. The data projector's got fancy video things happening. The kids' talk is fantastic. And you all go home saying, oh, I really like the kids' talk. Maybe the prayers are spectacular. The songs are great and deep and moving and reflective. But never the sermon. The sermon's always boring. Fishing expeditions for Jesus was not something boring. It was more than just catching fish. Fishing for Jesus is about mission. It's about a response. What happened that day that made it different from any other day was that God showed up. God showed up. God turned up in Jesus. Simon Peter and the others met God in Jesus. Let's go back to the very first reading that Steve read to us, the reading from Isaiah. The call of Isaiah, the story of that weird experience that Isaiah has in the temple. You see, Isaiah was doing his thing. He was working in the temple. That's what he did. That was his job. He was a temple assistant or attendant. He was in there worshipping one day. Regular worship, same song, same preacher who was boring. Prayers were long. But then God showed up. In a vision, in a dream, in something that was miraculous and unexplainable. Weird and wonderful visions of flying creatures. Smoke filled the temple, burning coal, strange voices. Sounds like any nightclub in Adelaide, doesn't it? But what does this say? And what does Luke's story say about Jesus? Both stories of Isaiah and Jesus in Luke tell of an experience which has subsequently led people to following the author of that experience. God showed up one day and Simon and his mates left their fishing and followed Jesus. Their lives were changed forever. Isaiah one day had this vision in the temple and his life was changed forever. When God shows up, no one stays the same. We notice that God doesn't limit God's call simply to in-house worship, but God moves and works and calls us out of where we are, out of the church, and out into our community. And God calls whoever God calls. Isaiah was doing his temple thing, and the disciples were doing their thing. They hadn't met Jesus before. And Jesus looks around at the disciples on the lake that day and says, I'll have you and you and you. Come. And they did. Let's go on mission. Let's go out there. I ask a question. What experience has moved you to a faith response lately? You don't have to answer that. I mean, where and when have you experienced God showing up and been stirred or challenged or motivated to actually do something different and challenging and exciting? Maybe you're even scared witless. Maybe you're just too frozen to actually respond. But maybe God works when God calls at best. When we experience God showing up. Maybe that's why worship is vital to Christians. The singing, the silence, the prayers, the visuals, communion, candles, pictures, and yes, even the boring preacher. But worship is always a response to an encounter with God. God turns up in some way, and through experience or place, we literally say, "Oh my God." Isaiah did it, Paul did it, the disciples did it, and his fishing buddies. God turns up, disturbs, challenges, motivates, blesses, and enters our lives. And then we're called to go forth. We're called to follow. We're called to go and do something. To set out into deep water, the disciples were told. Get in your boat and come out and push out into deep water and let down your nets. To be fishermen. To be fisherwomen. Because that's what fishermen and fisherwomen do. They fish. So what do we learn from our gospel reading today? We learn fish where Jesus says fish. My experiences of fishing have been quite poor because often I've fished in the wrong spot. The fish aren't there. They're over there and someone else is catching them. But when I go over there, they go over there. They're sneaky little things. But fish where Jesus says fish. Be who we are, where we are. Be Jesus in our social setting. To cast our professional net, so to speak, as fishermen or women into the sea where the fish are. Or to put it another way, be Christ in your workplace. Be Christ in your cricket team. Be Christ in the school. Be like Christ at the retirement village. Be Jesus where you are. Fisher men or women are not called to plumbing. They're called to fish. Plumbers are called to plumbing. Teachers to teaching. Shop assistants to shop assistants. John van der Laar, a preacher and a commentator, says this. According to our scriptures, the lesson for today, the measure of a church is not its buildings, its denominational affiliation, its faithfulness to certain doctrinal or political ideologies, or its size or its wealth. The measure of a church is on the way it integrates into the community in which it is placed, and how it becomes the hidden subversive influence for grace, bringing greater care to the broken, more accessible and sustainable resources to the needy, more companionship to the lonely, and more unyielding opposition to the forces that would rob or any human being of abundant life, which Jesus sought to bring. How can we allow the scriptures to call us again into being this kind of community within our wider community here in the area of McGill and wider and Morialta, where God has placed us, where we are placed? Maybe by listening to the voice or the call of Jesus and fish where Jesus says fish. To be the church where you are. To be the church where you are called. Not only in here, but more importantly, out there. Out there where you live, where you shop, where you learn, where you socialise. The setting of this story from Luke is a worship experience. Yes, there was a crowd. There was some preaching and teaching. But then there's the challenge. Let us go. Let us go out into deep water. It might be risky. Let us go to where the fish actually might be. Let us go and live in our community. Let us shop in our community. Let us educate ourselves in the community. Be God's people where you are. And in that challenge comes an experience that would impact lives forever. In that experience comes an awareness of God's promise, but also vulnerability, because it is scary. We might get wet. We might not get it right all the time. We might trip over. We might sink. We might even fall overboard. Yet when God shows up unexpectedly, remember Isaiah was doing his thing in the temple and Simon Peter was doing his thing on the beach. But when God shows up, people fall on their knees both literally and metaphorically. When we come to worship, are we expecting God to turn up? Or better, when we turn up to worship, can we see that God is already here and calling and asking us to go and fish where Jesus says fish? So Jesus, in a sense, says, will you come and follow me if I but call your name?